Thank you very much for coming to JSVille Society. I'm very lucky to have an expert on Brexit, Paul Goldsmith, who is also doing research into referenda. And he's written this book. You should all read this book. It's an amazing book, which I even saw in my local cafe. It's been on Sky TV talking about Brexit as well, I think. So it's obviously a pivotal event in UK politics and the economy, as we've in a sense seen today. So over to Mr. Goldsmith. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. So first of all, there's no experts on Brexit. There's only Brexperts. But here we go. Right. So I'm here because on the 23rd of June 2016, the country voted for Brexit to leave the EU. 17.4 million people, more people have voted for anything else in the history of UK politics, voted to leave. 16.3 million people voted for Remain, the second highest amount of people voted. So it was very much a country that was split. On the next day, a member of my lower sixth class said, "Why did this happen?" Because no one was really expecting it, and I felt I couldn't answer her well, and so I started reading. And by the time in the middle of July, my friend Jason, Jason is a Sky News reporter, he's there pointing on my Boris, and I were driving our daughters down to Peppa Pig World, and we were having a debate on why Britain voted for Brexit. I said, from my reading, it looked like the country was always ready to vote leave. He, who'd been on the campaign, said, no, the country changed during the campaign. And we both agreed to write a book together. Now that sounds like a cute story, and you're probably going, you're just telling us it sounds like a cute story, but it never actually happened. Here is Jason and I on the top of the log flume at Peppa Pig World on that actual day with our daughter's heads there, just to prove this actually did happen. Anyhow, we are the only, we're the only book on Brexit that secured an interview with Dominic Cummings, who ran the Vote Leave campaign. And he's a really, really important figure in political history. And in many, many years' time, people will need to probably study his influence. He worked on referendum campaigns in 2011 for electoral systems, in 2004 for regional assemblies, and he worked on this one. And he handed us a document which had never been published, in which he wrote a report for Business for Britain, which was the predecessor to Vote Leave, suggesting a strategy to win the referendum. So this is in the winter of 2014. In that document, you've clearly got people from all over the country, Thurrock in Essex, Nuneaton near Birmingham, Hendon, North London, using the actual words that the Vote Leave campaign used. People saying, I don't mind immigration, but I wish we could control it more. I wish we could decide on all our laws. I wish we could have control of our borders. And he used that to suggest take back control as a slogan. He actually said, it doesn't matter whether we take a position of X or Y about Z, but we should suggest that we take back control of Z. Now, a year later, in 2015, the Remain campaign did a similar focus group. And it was reported back that by the Remain campaign, Will Straw, who was the head of campaign, that not a single floating voter could tell them anything positive about being in the EU. They could tell them that the best thing about leaving is taking back control of money, borders, and laws. This is before the campaign even started. And so the Remain campaign knew all they had left was to do Project Fear about how the economy would collapse, but they also knew they were likely to lose. And that position that they had got themselves into was not started in 2014. It was in fact started in 1949 when this man went for a walk. And he was on a walking holiday. His name is Jean Monnet. He's astonishingly modest and humble in that not many people have heard of him. And he's here with Robert Schuman, who was the French foreign minister at the time. Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman were wrestling with how to get Germany back into the international community, to allow Germany to reindustrialize. It's important to recognize that Germany had effectively been invading France once in a generation for decades. And so there wasn't a huge amount of trust. But after what the lessons learned from the First World War was that Germany needed to be allowed to rebuild. And so Jean Monnet realised, why don't we pool our coal and steel industries? And therefore, if Germany were rearming, we'd know about it. And so he went to Robert Schuman and suggested this, and Robert Schuman went to different countries, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, as well as Germany, and said, oh, well, he asked other countries if they wanted to join, and said, why don't we form this European coal and steel community? Now, it was called the Schuman Declaration. That's why I'm saying Jean Monnet was humble, because it was his idea, but he allowed Robert Schuman to call it the Schuman Declaration, 1950 in May. And in it, Schuman said that the cooperation that this would engender would make war between these countries materially impossible. And in 1950, that was seen as crackpot, because it had been war after war after war. It's 70-something years later, 77 years later, and there hasn't been a war between the countries that are members of the EU, or what was at the time the European Coal and Steel Community. Now, Britain refused to get involved, and they refused to get involved even in negotiations for 3 reasons. One, they had won the war, and quite simply, they didn't need to rethink their economic and political arrangements. Secondly, they were trying to manage the relationship with the Americans, the Commonwealth as well, and Europe, and they didn't want to tie their boat to anything else. And thirdly, an innovative government led by Clement Attlee was setting up a national health service and a welfare state and full employment, and didn't want anyone to tell them they had to close this mine or anything like that. Which is why when Herbert Morrison, the Deputy Prime Minister, because Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister, was away, was tracked down to the Ivy restaurant after a night at the theatre by a civil servant who had been warned by Robert Schuman that if Britain didn't commit to negotiations, they would be taken away from them. Herbert Morrison said, "It's no good, the Durham miners would never wear it." And we decided not to take part in negotiations, even beginning for the European Coal and Steel Community. Reason one why we Brexited in 2016 is that we were absent at the creation of what was created. We couldn't shape it to our interests. It gets worse. After 5 years, it was realised that this was working, so let's do it for other parts of our economy. And so the European community was being created. Foreign ministers gathered in Brussels, and Britain was invited, no conditions, to be in this grouping. Britain decided not to send their Foreign Minister Harold Macmillan, but instead sent Russell Bretherton, a civil servant from the Department of Trade, who was given strict instructions not to agree to anything. He sat there, and this is at a time when he was in these meetings. He couldn't do any B-reels, he couldn't do Snapchat. He had to wait for a diplomatic bag every 4 days in which he had to put messages, and he received instructions. He was frequently putting messages saying, I shouldn't be here. This is real, this is going to work, we need to be part of this, I don't know why I'm here. Eventually, the Belgians got really frustrated and demanded that he be removed, and he was given a message to read out at the creation of the European community. Gentlemen, what you are trying to arrange will never be agreed. If it is agreed, it will never be ratified, and if it is ratified, it will never work. Au revoir, and bonne chance. And he walked out the room. He himself believed that Britain should have joined and been part of setting up. Now, what was set up, quite importantly, was a European community which was supranational, in that rather than just governments working with each other and being able to pull out and do different things, supranational meant this organisation was more powerful than nation states. That's another reason Britain didn't want to be part of it, but other countries were fine rebuilding together. And they had 4 freedoms: freedom of movement, capital, goods and services, and labour as well. And what happened was that Britain soon realised it was a mistake not to be involved. So Harold Macmillan, this is the Prime Minister at the time, went to France to try and persuade General Charles de Gaulle, we've made a mistake, can we join the community? Charles de Gaulle said, yes, if you put Europe first. And Macmillan said, well, no, we can't do that. We have to have imperial preference. We have to put the Commonwealth first, but we can put you on equal footing. And Charles de Gaulle refused Britain's application, saying that it wasn't ready to be European. Charles de Gaulle died in 1969, and we got our most Europhile Prime Minister, which is Edward Heath. And Edward Heath managed to persuade Georges Pompidou, of the famous centre in Paris, to allow Britain to join. And so on the 30th of June 1970, our application went in. Now, this is really important. Lots of things had been decided by then. It had been decided that if one rule was made for one country, it had to apply for everybody. It had been decided that a rule that was made in Europe overcame nation states as well. And this is important. All of the arrangements, the common agricultural policy, a series of taxes and subsidies to support farmers had been agreed. On the morning of our application going in, the common fisheries policy was created. Basically, the countries that were going in had 4/5 of Britain's waters, and the other countries in the European community said, we'll have some of that. And so they created a common fisheries policy that pooled fisheries. And Britain had to accept all of it. It's called the acquis communautaire. If you printed it out, it would be paper piling up to here. That's what you agree to when you join. And that, just so you know, is what David Cameron was attempting to undo between 2012 and 2014 with leaders of European countries. He was saying, can you change all this stuff so Britain might stay in? But they knew that they couldn't, because if you change it for Britain, you had to change for other people. And so we ended up with this situation. We send the EU 350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead. And in order, I'll come back to this, but in order to understand that, you have to understand that Britain was absent at the creation, and secondly, Britain had to contort itself economically and politically in order to get in. We had to change our tax systems. We had to change how we traded. We had to say to these Commonwealth countries we traded with for years, we're going to have to pay tariffs to import your goods and things like that. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that we didn't hold a referendum to join the European Economic Community. Denmark did. They said yes. Ireland did. They said yes. Norway did. They said no because of the fisheries policy. France held a referendum to decide whether we could join. We decided not to. The reason why is because Ted Heath said, well, all of the, we just won the election, the Tories, and we had it in our manifesto that we're joining the EU. It was pointed out to him that everybody had it in their manifesto, so nobody could choose not to. And eventually the Labour Party were persuaded to put in their manifesto for the 74 election to have a referendum on whether to stay in the European Economic Community. So this referendum was in 1975. This is Margaret Thatcher, commonly known as a Eurosceptic, but in fact at the time very much pro-Europe. This is a sweater with all the flags on there. Now she didn't actually join the campaign, neither did Harold Wilson, who was the Labour Prime Minister. This referendum was before any referendums were regulated at all. The Yes campaign had 10 times the amount of money as the No campaign. The Yes campaign had the support of every single newspaper. And the Yes campaign and the No campaign was basically led by people on the far extremes of politics, including the National Front, a racist organisation, the Communist Party, the Maoist Party, Trotskyists and people like that. Roy Jenkins, who was the actual leader of the Yes campaign, said that if Britain voted to leave the European Economic Community, it would go to the old people's homes of European economies. And quite frankly, I don't like the look of some of the wardens. And the reason I'm telling you this is because one of the absolute key things that Matthew Ellis and Dominic Cummings, leading the Vote Leave campaign, knew they had to do was to find politicians who were actually popular to help lead the campaign. And that's why it's so important that Boris Johnson, who in 2016 was extremely popular, successful London mayor of 2 terms, had led London during the Olympics, and had been someone who was very Eurosceptic throughout his life. He joined the Vote Leave campaign. And this is Jason, who I wrote a book with, and he followed them. He was on the Vote Leave bus, saw it go around the country, saw people respond to Johnson in a way that they don't respond to other people. This was absolutely vital because it left David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn leading the Remain campaign. And that's quite an important thing to know. Because if I just go, where are they? They are here. Jeremy Corbyn was a lifelong Eurosceptic. He had voted against European integration all of his life. He believed it was a capitalist club. He went on the last leg and was asked do you like the European Union? He said, I give it a 7 out of 10. That is not a leader of a referendum campaign. David Cameron did okay, but he was a lifelong Eurosceptic. He had taken Britain out of Europhilic communities and things like that, and he had written things about it as well. The other thing was, because the Prime Minister led the Remain campaign, the Vote Leave campaign could say, if you don't like how the country's being run, vote leave. And that was a big problem. I'm just going to go back a little bit. So, referendum happens, 68 to 32 to yes, 1975. All things quietened down until Margaret Thatcher, who is still the Eurosceptics' darling, gave away more sovereignty than any British Prime Minister ever has. She, in her quest for free markets, she decided to help create a single European area, or the single market. No tariffs, so no taxes, no non-tariff barriers, so basically an insurance agent can work in Spain, no regulations and things like that. And in order to get this done, she accepted from Jacques Delors, who was the leader, the president of the European Economic Community at the time, to release the national veto. At the time, a country could veto laws and things they didn't like. Delors said to her, but it would be impossible to persuade countries to get rid of their barriers unless you have qualified majority voting. That means that one intransigent country can't bring this down. And she agreed to it. Other things that Jacques Delors got in the Single European Act was a statement that European monetary union is one of our aims. And Thatcher asked her civil servants, what's this? Why have they put this in there? What does this mean? They said, oh, don't worry about it. They put that in everything. Sure enough, the next day after this was signed, Jacques Delors set up the Delors Commission, which basically created the euro. And in 1992, a document called the Maastricht Treaty was signed by all the European countries. Not without a fight. There were some referendums against it. This was a huge thing. Instead of European community cooperation, it was European Union integration. Complete integration. Instead of just freedom of movement of workers, European citizenship. It meant people could come from abroad and have exactly the same rights as British people. And the euro. And these are Conservative MPs. These Conservative MPs ended up having the whip withdrawn, having voted against the government in a vote of confidence. But they were then reinstated. And at the end of an ITV interview, John Major was asked why he doesn't just sack them and get rid of them. And he said, well, it's better to have the bastards inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. Unbeknown to him, one particularly influential bastard was already outside the tent, one Nigel Farage. Now, Farage was the first person we interviewed, and one of the things he challenged us to do was to find anything that he ever said about immigration before 2004. In 2004, Tony Blair decided to allow, and he was the Prime Minister at the time, untrammeled immigration from the new countries joining the EU, from Poland, Bulgaria, Poland, Czech Republic, and various countries like that, whereas other countries weren't allowing it. They were doing transition controls for 7 years. Suddenly, Farage found that when the UKIP were campaigning, people from the Labour Party, from Conservatives, Lib Dems were coming up and going, I want to vote for you because you're the only person who might stop this happening. There was no mandate for what happened. Now, there's Nigel Farage launched an excellent book. In the end, I put it to you, he's the most successful politician in this country for the last 30 years. You may not like his methods, but from outside the political system, he achieved this. And he partly achieved this because he wasn't part of the designated organisation that ran the Vote Leave campaign. And so he was able to go around the country and say to people, in 2015, UKIP had 4 million votes and 1 seat. The SNP had 1.5 million votes and 56 seats. He said, general elections don't work. Referendums do. It's your chance to make a difference. Because the truth is, this is Gerhard Schroeder, who was the German Chancellor at the same time as Tony Blair was Prime Minister. In Germany, in 2002, they had an election. And Schroeder basically, they had a whole debate about whether immigration from these countries, and it was a great, great, great achievement by the European Union to welcome these countries in. But whether immigration should be controlled, and Germans decided to do that. There was one line of immigration in the 2001 manifesto. It just happened. Worse, Even pro-Europe, even left-wing Labour MPs in the cabinet said to Tony Blair, you should do a migrant impact fund. So where they go, money goes to increase school places, improve hospitals, to help subsidise jobs and things like that. And Blair and his Chancellor, Gordon Brown, said, well, no, I don't want to do that, because then it might admit that there's a problem. This is a minister called John Denham, and he wrote, and obviously this wasn't published until afterwards, he wrote a letter to Tony Blair in 2006, 2 years after the accession countries joined the EU, and therefore we had millions of people coming to Britain. And he said, let me tell you about what life's like in Southampton Itches. This is in the south of the country. I have people whose wages have gone down by 50%. And they've gone down by 50% because a larger supply of people have come in. I've got queues at A&E because people are coming from countries where they don't have GPs. I've got people can't get places in schools. He said, all I'm asking for is for some help. I agree with the policy, but I'm asking for some help. This is a very famous, it's called the elephant graph by Branko Milanovic, an economist in America. So if you line up everybody in the world for their income, if you take this point, 80% of the world earn less than this person, 20% earn more. As you can see, there's some people who got very rich in the 20 years from 1988 to 2008. This is the Chinese middle class, Asian middle class. They have been developed. This is working class in developed countries, America and Britain. They have lost money. It's not racist to question why government decisions had meant you were put in a position where you lost money. It's not racist to say, could we have had a vote on this? Could we have decided? It's not racist to say to a government, to Tony Blair, could you provide us with some help? Instead, these people were called racist, lazy bigots. And when you do that, when you don't respond to people's needs and demands, you get Nigel Farage's, you get Donald Trump's, you get Brexit. And then what happened was people started to lose trust in government's ability to do anything. Now you had the financial crash of 2008 and the policies that happened after then. You had terrorism in our country and in other countries as well. You had boatloads of migrants, and they were coming over into Italy. Nigel Farage played on this quite a lot, that they could just come to England. You had a monetary crisis in Greece, in which Greece were having to come onto the streets to deal with people protesting about the EU. This all led to Michael Gove, who was also in the Vote Leave campaign, saying that people have had enough of experts. He was immediately interrupted by his interviewer from Sky News, Faisal Islam. What he was actually saying is, people are fed up of experts funded by European organisations who say that Europe is good for you. But the problem is people were fed up with experts. They stopped listening to people telling them that the economy would crash, you'd lose your jobs and things like that. I just want to give a quick mention to this guy, Steve Baker, unsung hero of Brexit, we like to call him. He came into Parliament in 2010 and started to learn about parliamentary procedures. It's a lot of the work and the machinations he did in the background of getting amendments to do with the EU referendum that forced David Cameron to call a referendum. David Cameron did not need to call a referendum, and he certainly shouldn't have called a referendum with absolutely no plan for one of the outcomes. That was clearly a bit stupid. And he also got the question changed from yes and no to remain in leave. In the end, the British people didn't get this. This is François Mitterrand, the French president, Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor. They started holding hands at a ceremony to remember the Battle of Verdun in the First World War. They don't know why, but all they do know is that they never thought they'd be 40 years on from the last war of France and Germany, and it not looking like there ever would be one. Now, I just want to talk about the chaos that happened afterwards. Because Cameron didn't think he'd lose, he didn't prepare for a leave vote. He then resigned. He left Theresa May to deliver a policy neither she nor her government believed in. She was challenged at first by Gina Miller because she tried to get the government to pull us out of Europe. It's called invoking Article 50, and Parliament had to vote. Parliament did vote, 550 to 50, in favour of invoking Article 50, writing letters to the EU. But she did that with no plan on how we would actually leave and what deal that we would have. And then what effectively started happening is that negotiations weren't working because Europe were not going to give the UK a particularly good good deal. So she got her ministers to Chequers, cabinet ministers to Chequers, which is the country between the Prime Minister. She told them if they didn't sign up to the plan, that even though they arrived in ministerial cars, they can get a taxi out. And some of them actually did. She got defeated massively in Parliament over the deals she tried to do, with the biggest defeat ever since 1918. And then she resigned. We all know what happened next, is that Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. And maybe had he become Prime Minister in 2016, some things might have been different. He then attempted to silence, to prorogue Parliament, suspend Parliament, which was overturned by the Supreme Court. And also then Hilary Benn, who was a Labour MP, introduced a bill that basically allowed Parliament to take over the running of the country, more or less, and say there can't be no deal. And so he called an election, which he won by a long way, and Britain left the EU. So, what's the situation? Well, as we know, you've probably been at immigration places where you can't obviously use your EU passport. It takes a little bit longer. You don't have the freedom of travel you used to do, although some of you will do because you'll have your EU passports. So that's okay. So we don't have free movement of people anymore. We also have a problem in Northern Ireland. So just a quick explanation, it's called a trilemma. With Northern Ireland, you can either leave if you leave the single market in the customs union, which we were promised by Prime Minister we do, if we can't then have no border checks on the land of Ireland and no Irish sea trade border between the Northern Irish and Great Britain. If you have two of these, you have to have, so if you have these two, you have to have border checks in Ireland. If you have these two, you have to have special status for a trade border basically between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. This is what we have at the moment. If you have these two, if you want these two, you have to have Northern Ireland as part of the customs union single market. Calling for all three is like asking for unicorns. And it's basically unresolvable. That's not to say the EU hasn't implemented the Northern Irish Protocol slightly unfairly. So, for instance, there are stories of meals going to old people's homes in Northern Ireland where they have to fill out as much paperwork as for, let's say, widgets that can easily go across the border. If there's an address of an old people's home, then that's where it's going. It's pretty simple, but the EU are implementing it religiously. It's their right to do that. We've also got trade. It's quite interesting to see that whilst EU imports from the UK gone up, EU exports to the UK gone down. Look, what I would say is that when Boris Johnson met with the Italian Foreign Minister in 2017, he said to the Italian Foreign Minister, "We won't buy your prosecco." And the Foreign Minister said, "Well, we won't buy your fish and chips, but that's not your problem. We lose one customer, you lose 27. Another thing that's happened is that we're trying to restrict who uses our waters, so there's battles over fish as well. All these things will take years to resolve properly. And as we know, it's very, very difficult to stop people in boats coming to... Now, they're refugees, they may be economic migrants, but we used to have an organisation we were part of where we could make deals. We've lost that, we chose not to be. In terms of the benefits of Brexit, they produced a document in early 2022. There are rules and laws we can do that we couldn't do around taxes. We can decide on our laws, we can try and manage our borders. It's very difficult with globalisation, as you know. We can make our own decisions around vaccinations, foreign policy, sanctions, and things like that. But ultimately, we can't really know what will happen until 20, 30 years' time. And by that time, I mean, it could be too late to turn back, but who knows? But the key thing for you to understand is that British Prime Ministers and British political leaders never sold the EU to the British people. And in order to get the British people to vote us back in, and maybe some of you will be part of the Rejoin campaign, and maybe that's the plan you have to explain how it benefits the British people. We were not there when it was created, so we couldn't create it in our interests. We had to consult ourselves politically and economically when we joined, and it was never explained or sold to us by our political leaders the benefits of being there. And that's why, on 23rd of June 2016, we voted to leave the EU. We voted to leave the EU, but also because there is insufficient regulation of referendums. A Prime Minister was able to call a referendum with no intention of delivering a result, resign, leaving the implementation of it to a government that didn't even believe in the policy, with incomplete instructions from the electorate. Leave means lots of things. So we still have a long way to go. Any questions? Yes.
So you mentioned the role of the media and how people get tired of experts. Emily Maitlis said in her speech that she actually felt that the BBC had an unconscious bias towards the Leave campaign because they were always trying really hard to find economists that would support the Brexit argument, and it would be 90% of economists would support.
So it's called the law of due partiality.
Yeah.
So what would happen is you'd have this one economist called Patrick Minford who was shoveled onto lots of programmes. Mr. Wallace is laughing because he knows what I'm going to say. And you'd have, there'd be an announcement that 1 million economists have said X, including Nobel Prize winners. And then the BBC was so concerned about being seen to be impartial that they would have this one economist say, well, it's wrong. And they would give the same balance to each other. And Emily Maitlis's point, as has been made by others, is that if it's raining outside the window, instead of finding someone that can say it's not raining outside the window, look outside the window. The problem is they were talking about economic forecasts, much of which have been wrong, by the way, the economic forecasts of what would happen if we did Brexit. But they were talking about economic forecasts, and forecasts can be wrong. So that was what they would do, is list all the times people have been wrong. The people who didn't forecast the financial crisis are telling you this would happen. But it's called due partiality, and it is something that needs to be discussed because it's still going on now. Questions? Any other questions? Ms. Wallace?
Yeah, do you think we're likely to join the European Free Trade Area?
I think in the end, so the European Free Trade Area allows us effectively to be in a customs union where we can have trade without tariffs, and it'll be far easier. At some point, some party that doesn't feel emotionally connected to defending Leave might decide we actually need to do something sensible with our trade arrangements, because we have the Northern Ireland problem can't be solved really any other way. So possibly, but it will take a long time, and you'll need certain people to not be involved in politics anymore. Sophia?
Do you think this will encourage Scottish independence?
Yes, because in 2014 it was like, well, if you leave Britain, you'll leave the EU, and they won't let you back in again. Well, every single region in Scotland voted for the EU, and they were taken out against their will. It doesn't quite tally when they go, we want to have independence, but we're going to join the EU, because then you don't get independence, particularly monetary. But it would make sense. Whether they'll get in is a different thing, because Spain might vote against it.
To what extent do you think that Brexit has contributed to the current economic troubles?
Well, the problem is that we have to go with counterfactuals, and for the Brexiteers, COVID was quite useful, because they can just blame everything on COVID, and then Remainers blame everything on Brexit. It's part of it, and denying that would be silly. I think we have to get to registration. Thank you very much. See you next time.